A promise could be a shelter, or it could be a cage, polished until it looked like honor. Isolde Stoneheart had learned the distinction too late, standing beneath a full moon, while two packs watched her in ceremonial white, waiting for a vow that had been spoken over her cradle before she had language enough to refuse it. The prevailing belief in her valley said fate was clean, inevitable, and sacred when it arrived on the correct night. Yet fate, she discovered, could wear a council seal, smile for witnesses, and still choose humiliation as its preferred blade. The sacred clearing smelled of pine smoke, wet earth, and wolf musk sharpened by anticipation. Torches ringed the stone altar in steady orange lines, and beyond them, the pack members stood in layered ranks according to blood and rank, dark cloaks against silvered grass. Isolde's fingers shook once, then stilled as she folded them over the crest cloak draped across her forearms, the cloak she was meant to receive back from Alaric Darkwater after his bite marked their union. Her pulse counted each heartbeat like a warning drum. She had known him since childhood, had sparred with him at 12, had sat through council feasts at 16 while their parents spoke of heirs and alliances as though children were harvest plans. Alaric did not take the cloak. He stood on the far side of the altar with his jaw tight and his expression carved blank, his beta at his shoulder, and 3 elders behind him. Moonlight glazed the silver embroidery at his cuffs. His gaze touched her once, then moved to the crowd as if she were a task and not a woman. "Speak your claim," intoned Elder Brenna, voice echoing against the standing stones. Alaric inhaled, and Isolde knew something was wrong before his first word. No warmth. No bond call. Only performance. "I refuse the match." The clearing did not gasp all at once. The shock moved in ripples, a low tide of murmurs and stiffened postures. Isolde felt the sound strike her skin and pass through her bones. For a moment she thought she had misheard him, that the moon wind had bent the syllables into cruelty by mistake. Elder Brenna frowned. "You stand before both councils. Explain yourself." Alaric finally looked straight at Isolde. "I was bound to this arrangement before I knew her true nature. Since winter, fields touched by her hand have failed. 3 litters were born weak in households under her blessing rounds. Hunters call her barren luck when they think no one hears." His mouth curled, brief and contemptuous. "I hear." Isolde's throat closed. "That is not true." He ignored her. "I will not bind my bloodline to a curse." The words landed harder than a slap because they were measured, prepared, chosen for maximum injury. Isolde searched the faces around the altar for someone willing to challenge him. Her aunt looked away. Her old training captain stared at the ground. Even her father, who had worn Stoneheart blue with ferocious pride in every council she could remember, kept his hands behind his back and his eyes fixed on the torch nearest him. "I am still standing here," she thought, "and no one sees me. I am breathing, but I am already being spoken about as if I have gone cold." This is what erasure feels like. It is not loud. It is procedural. It is a room full of people deciding your worth can be revised by a rumor and a useful fear. If I kneel now, I hand them the story whole. If I scream, I become proof of instability. If I beg, I confirm his accusation that I was waiting to be chosen. I am not asking to be chosen. I am asking not to be lied into the ground. She lifted her chin. "Say it plainly, Alaric. You found a better political bed and need a cleaner excuse." Several warriors shifted, startled at her directness. Alaric's eyes hardened. "You have no standing to name my motives," he said. "You have no standing at all." He stepped forward then, close enough for her to catch the bitter metal scent of controlled aggression. He took the crest cloak from her arms, not as a partner receiving a gift, but as an officer seizing contraband. The movement was abrupt enough to rake his knuckles across the fresh moon paint on her skin. "By authority of Darkwater Council," he said, projecting now so every witness could carry the line to every border village by dawn. Isolde Stoneheart is released from mate covenant and stripped of future claim. Released. Stripped. The legal words were crisp, and each one erased a year of expectation. Elder Brenna opened her mouth as if to object, but Alaric's Beta leaned in and murmured something sharp at her ear. She closed it again. The ceremony should have ended there in silence. Instead, Alaric made it worse. Before dawn, after the crowd dispersed into knots of gossip and predatory curiosity, Isolde was summoned to the inner gate hall where both councils had reconvened under blue-white lanterns. The stone floor still held the night's chill. She stood alone at the center while scribes unrolled law cloth, and a pair of sentries took position behind her as though she might lunge. Alaric descended the short stair to the gate dais, cloak clasped at his throat, expression settled into administrative disdain. "Remove her house crest," he ordered. One sentry reached for the chain at Isolde's neck. She flinched, then held still on sheer pride. The chain snapped against her collarbone, a sting bright enough to make her eyes water. The Stoneheart sigil, a small obsidian disc carved with mountain runes, clattered across the floor and spun until it struck the base of the dais. Alaric did not pick it up. "Do not do this," Isolde said, voice low, not pleading yet. "You know what border law becomes for uncrested females. You should have considered consequence before bringing rot into my house. I brought nothing except loyalty." Your loyalty did not prevent blight. The lie kept widening each time he repeated it, as if repetition could turn invention into record. Behind him, Counselor Maeve folded her hands and spoke in the dry tone of a clerk closing a case. By joint emergency petition, she is denied escort and denied winter stores. Let neighboring territory decide whether to absorb or cull. Cull. The word scraped through Isolde's spine. Alaric reached for the collar at her throat, the white wedding band woven with silver thread that marked her as claimed in waiting. He tore it free so hard the edge cut skin under her jaw. Warmth ran down her neck. He held the ripped collar up between two fingers for all to see. "Baron Luck," he said, almost conversationally now, "does not cross my threshold." Laughter did not follow. This was not joy. It was worse. It was approval, shaped like silence. The border gate opened with a grinding groan. Frost wind knifed through the hall, carrying the scent of snowfields and distant cedar. A sentry shoved her once between the shoulder blades, not enough to drop her, enough to declare ownership over where she stood. Isolde looked at her father one final time. His mouth was a hard line. He did not move. The shove came again, harder. She stumbled over the gate lip barefoot, ceremonial skirts tangling around her calves, and fell to her knees on frozen gravel outside the line of torchlight. The gate slammed behind her with iron finality. For several breaths, she stayed there, palms on ice-crusted earth, listening to the fading echo of a life closing. Then instinct rose through the shock. Move or die. She ripped the hem of her white gown at the thigh for stride, wrapped one strip around her bleeding feet, and started north where the boundary stones changed from Darkwater black to Frostborn slate. The Frostborn territory was supposed to be worse, ruled by the king people named only in lowered voices, a male who had executed traitors at dawn and had not spoken in a year after his brother was murdered at treaty table. Wolves said silence made him more dangerous, not less, because no one could predict the shape of his judgment. 3 hours into the crossing, wind scoured her face raw and turned the blood on her skin tacky and dark. Branches whipped her arms. Her breath burned with each inhale. She kept moving by counting landmarks she had memorized as a child, forbidden to approach this line. The split pine, the stone with quartz seam, the ravine that sounded like water though no stream ran there in winter. By first gray light she reached the final marker, a waist-high slab carved with frostborn runes that hummed faintly when touched. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the stone and left a red palm print across ancient script. This was the breaking point she had not named while it happened. Not the public refusal. Not the torn collar. This moment. Choosing foreign law over familiar cruelty. Choosing unknown teeth over certain erasure. Behind her, a horn sounded from Darkwater Watch. Short, sharp, hunting pattern. They were not done with her. Panic gave her one last burst. She crossed the marker and half ran, half fell down a narrow slope into Frostborn Pines, where the snow lay untouched except for old wolf tracks frozen into glassy ridges. Her wrapped feet slipped. A hidden root caught her ankle and sent her hard against a fallen log. Pain flashed up her side. She tasted copper and bit back a cry. Wolves emerged before she could stand. 6 of them, massive gray-black coats striped with frost, eyes bright as banked coals. They spread in a trained arc, not rushing, not hesitant, each movement economical. 2 shifted partially as they closed, shoulders broadening into near-human frames while claws remained at their fingertips. "Do not move," the nearest one said. His voice carried authority without strain. Frostborn insignia glinted at his throat. Name and origin. Isolde dragged in air that felt like broken glass. Isolde Stoneheart. Darkwater expelled. She swallowed, dizzy. "I seek sanctuary." The wolves exchanged a glance too fast to read. Sanctuary claims carried legal weight older than their current borders. So did rejection edicts. Political tinder in female form. "Search her," ordered another guard. They checked her for concealed blades, letters, toxin vials. One found the snapped remnant of her collar and held it up between 2 claws. His mouth tightened. "Take her to the king." She expected chains. Instead, they gave her a cloak with the crest removed and bound her wrists in front with leather, practical restraint rather than punishment. Even that small distinction pierced her composure. She did not cry. She did not have the water left. They brought her through Frostborn's outer gates as dawn broke fully, over stone bridges rimed with ice, and into a fortress cut from mountain granite. War banners hung motionless in the cold, still air. At the center stood the hall, where judgment was rendered, high-ceilinged and severe, fire braziers throwing restless light across scarred flagstones. The room quieted when they entered. At the far end, on a blackwood chair carved with wolf heads and winter runes, sat Xavier Frostborn. He was larger than rumor and far more still, dark hair to his collar, broad shoulders wrapped in plain black rather than royal display, hands resting on the arms of the chair as though he had taught them not to clench. His face bore the composed austerity of a man who had made silence into armor. Amber lived in his eyes like banked fire. 1 year without speech, Isolde remembered. 1 year of rulings delivered by gesture and written order. A captain pushed her gently to her knees at the center mark. She could not hold herself upright much longer. The hall tilted. Sound narrowed to a rushing tunnel. She lifted her head anyway, found the king through blur and pain, and forced out the only plea that mattered. "Do not return me to them." Silence stretched, taut as drawn wire. Then Xavier Frostborn stood, descended 1 step from the dais, and answered in a voice rough with disuse and absolute command. "No one takes what is under my protection." The words struck the hall harder than any battle horn. Men who had watched Xavier Frostborn sentence traitors without sound stared at him as if they had seen a mountain crack. One elder rose halfway from his bench, hand braced on carved oak, then sat again when the king turned his head by a fraction. Isolde remained on her knees at the center mark, breath tearing shallow through her chest, while the leather binding at her wrists bit into skin gone numb from cold. Captain Torin recovered first. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "Darkwater sounded a hunting call across the line. If they claim theft of—" Xavier lifted one hand. Torin fell silent. That hand was scarred across the knuckles and still except for a faint tremor near the thumb, as though restraint itself cost him effort. Firelight traced the old white lines on his skin, then climbed the severe angle of his jaw. Up close, nothing about him resembled the legends of mindless brutality told to pups at bedtime. The crux was more dangerous than cruelty, disciplined power, precise and cold, now directed toward her. Isolde fought to stay upright. Her vision narrowed at the edges, then widened again in sharp, painful pulses. She smelled iron from her own blood, old cedar in the pillars, ash drifting from braziers, and under all of it the living scent of wolves packed tight in a room built for war councils, not mercy. She had crossed into enemy territory expecting chains or a clean death. Instead, the most feared alpha in the north had broken a year of silence for her plea, and the Hall did not know what to do with that fact. Xavier spoke again, each word rough with disuse and deliberate in its placement. Cut her bindings. No one moved for one taut heartbeat. Then Torin stepped forward, drew a short blade, and severed the leather strap in a single clean motion. Isolde's hands dropped into her lap, fingers stiff and swollen, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Freedom felt heavier than restraint when she had nowhere to set it down. An elder in winter blue robes rose, outrage lending him courage. Sanctuary cannot be declared unilaterally in a contested rejection case. Darkwater Council will call this provocation. If she is cursed as reported, bringing her under roof risks. Xavier's gaze settled on him. Amber deepened, predator bright without shifting. Name the law. The elder's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Ancient Sanctuary Clause requires declared innocence or blood-kin sponsorship. Read it, Xavier said. The scribe nearest the dais scrambled for a rolled hide, hands shaking enough to rattle the bone clasp. He found the line and read aloud, voice thin. Any wolf or unmated female crossing a marked boundary under threat of unlawful culling may claim Moon Sanctuary by spoken plea to the ruling Alpha. Protection stands until tribunal or proven treachery. A low murmur passed through the hall. The clause had dust on it, rarely invoked, and almost never by someone cast out with this much public contempt attached to her name. Xavier did not look away from Isolde. She spoke the plea. I answered. His gaze shifted to the rows of warriors and counselors. Record it. The scribe bent immediately, ink scratching. Within the next few heartbeats, authority in the room realigned, not softened, not kind, simply decided. The captain offered Isolde an arm. She hesitated, then accepted because her legs were beginning to tremble uncontrollably. When she rose, pain flared along her side where she had struck the fallen log, and she swayed. Xavier moved down another step from the dais, a single silent motion that halted half the room like a command bark. He did not touch her. He stood near enough that she felt the heat of him through the chill soaked into her dress. Can you stand? He asked. The question was practical, not tender, yet it undid her more than any accusation at the border gate. She nodded once because speech seemed fragile. His attention dropped to the cut under her jaw, where the wedding collar had torn free. The expression that crossed his face was brief and unreadable, a hardening that looked less like curiosity and more like controlled anger pointed elsewhere. He turned to Torin. Infirmary. Senior healer. Warmth first. Questions later. Torin touched fist to chest. At once. 2 guards approached with a blanket and a basin of steaming water. The blanket was thick wool lined in fox fur, clearly pulled from a war chest rather than guest stores. Isolde flinched when one guard reached for her shoulder. Humiliation had rewired every gesture into potential harm. The guard stopped immediately, waited, then offered the blanket open-palmed until she took it herself. Frostborn discipline, she realized dimly, was not gentleness, but it had rules. Rules could be survived. As she wrapped the wool around her body, her gaze lifted to Xavier again. He had returned to stillness on the step below his throne, broad frame anchored, face carved into command. Yet she could feel his attention on her, like a line pulled taut between two distant cliffs. She should have looked away. Looking away had kept her alive in Darkwater halls for years. She did not. His eyes met hers, and the room receded. Heat rose from the base of her spine in a sudden fierce climb, not fever, not fear. Something older than language and sharper than either. It moved through her nerves in silver-bright pulses that made every wound wake at once and then vanish beneath a new kind of ache. Her heartbeat stumbled, then corrected itself to a rhythm that was not entirely her own. One beat, then another, answered from across the stone between them. Xavier drew a hard breath. Amber bled into his irises, molten at the edges. The pupils thinned. His fingers curled against his palms, and she heard, unmistakably, the soft, wet puncture as claws pushed through skin on reflex before he forced them back. Gasps rippled through the council benches. Torin took one instinctive step toward his king and stopped when Xavier shook his head. The scent hit her next, winter cedar and storm ozone, clean and wild and devastatingly familiar in a way that made no rational sense. It flooded her lungs until breathing felt like surrender and alarm braided together. Hunger followed, swift and disorienting, not for food or safety, but for closeness so profound it bordered on panic. The animal part of her went rigid, alert and yearning in the same breath. No, she thought, and the thought fractured into raw present tense terror. No, this cannot be mine. I have just been cast out in white cloth and blood. I have no crest, no home, no right to ask for anything, and my body is betraying me by reaching. I am not ready to need another alpha. I am not ready to trust a pulse I can feel outside my own chest. If this is a trick of exhaustion, let it pass. If this is real, how do I survive it? Her knees weakened. She gripped the blanket tighter with both hands. Xavier took one involuntary step toward her, then locked every muscle as if he had stepped to the edge of a precipice and refused to fall. He looked stricken for a heartbeat, and in that flicker she saw the wound beneath the legend. A male who had buried his voice with his brother and lived inside stone silence ever since, now dragged toward connection by force he had not invited. Majesty, Elder Varric whispered, alarmed. Command? Xavier did not answer him. His gaze held Isolde's with a focus so fierce it felt like touch. The bond threaded itself between them anyway, a bright pressure behind her ribs, then a visible filament of gold-white light that sparked once in the air and vanished before most of the hall could register it. Torin swore under his breath. The scribe dropped his quill. Mate. The word arrived from old stories and sacred law, from moon rites and whispered songs, and she rejected it on reflex because accepting it would mean her life had pivoted again in the span of minutes. Yet every instinct she possessed aligned around the same brutal truth. This was not ceremony politics. This was not negotiated alliance. This was recognition. Xavier's voice came lower now, stripped of throne and title until it sounded like confession dragged over broken stone. Who cut you? The question startled her. She blinked, disoriented by the shift from supernatural shock to specific injury. Alaric, she said, the name tasting bitter. At the gate hall. A growl rolled through Xavier's chest, almost inaudible but felt in the floorboards. Several warriors glanced at one another, unsettled by hearing any unguarded sound from him after so long. He closed his hand slowly, blood from his punctured palm running over old scars. Torin, he said without looking away from her. Send for Lawkeeper Sen, secure testimony from her at healer's discretion. Dispatch riders to border stones. Darkwater is not to cross one claw length without formal challenge. Torin bowed. Done. The practical orders steadied the room, but not her. Isolde's pulse still matched his in uncanny cadence, each beat a silent call and response that left her unmoored. Fear remained, heavy and rational. So did the pull. Xavier descended the final step. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough that she could see the tension at the hinge of his jaw and the fine tremor in his injured hand. "You are under Frostborn law now," he said. "No one touches you without your consent. Not healers, not council, not me." Her throat tightened. She managed a raw whisper. "Why?" His answer took time, as if each word had to be relearned after a year locked away. "Because you asked for protection." A pause, then quieter, meant only for her. "And because I know what it is to be used as a symbol while bleeding like a person." The confession hit harder than the bond surge. It was not polished rhetoric. It was recognition from one exile to another, spoken in front of witnesses who had likely never heard him speak of himself at all. A healer arrived at a near run, silver braids swinging, carrying satchels that smelled of moonroot and crushed juniper. She knelt beside Isolde and waited for permission with her hands visible and empty. Isolde nodded. The healer eased her toward a wheeled chair draped in wool and tucked a heated stone at her feet. As they turned toward the infirmary corridor, Isolde looked back once. Xavier remained where she had left him, tall and immovable in the brazier glow, blood drying on his palm, amber still bright in his eyes. He did not call her back. He did not mask what had happened either. Locked in that final glance, they acknowledged the same dangerous equation. She had crossed his border asking not to be returned, and in answering, he had bound far more than law. The infirmary corridor swallowed the noise of the war hall within a dozen steps, replacing it with the hushed discipline of healers at work and the steady hiss of banked braziers. Isolde felt every jolt of the wheeled chair in her bruised ribs as they rolled over stone seams worn smooth by generations of wounded wolves. A young attendant moved ahead to open each heavy door before they reached it, eyes lowered, posture precise, as if uncertainty about her status had already been answered by the king himself, and everyone understood the cost of forgetting it. The senior healer introduced herself as Mayera and brought Isolde into a narrow chamber lined with shelves of dried herbs, stitched bandages, and ceramic jars stamped with frostborn runes. Heat rose from a copper basin near the bed. Snow tapped softly at the high window. The room smelled of moonroot, clean linen, and cedar smoke. "Tell me before I touch," Mara said, crouching to Isolde's eye level. "Where does it hurt most?" Isolde almost said nowhere out of habit, then stopped. "Ribs. Left side, feet, throat. Good. We begin there." Mara worked with efficient gentleness, cutting away fabric that had frozen to skin, cleaning the cut beneath Isolde's jaw, binding her feet in warm salve wraps, and pressing careful fingers along her ribs until Isolde sucked in a sharp breath at one spot. "Bruised, not broken," Mara murmured. "Lucky. Lucky." The words scraped like grit. Isolde stared at the rafters and said nothing. When Mara finished, she settled Isolde beneath thick blankets and placed a clay cup by the bedside. "Moonroot broth when you can keep it down. Sleep if sleep comes. There is a bell rope on your right." Her gaze paused on the torn skin at Isolde's throat. "No one enters without your permission unless you are unconscious and bleeding out. Those are the rules tonight." After the door closed, silence expanded. Not empty silence, but the kind that made room for memory to enter. She tried to keep her eyes open. She failed. The nightmare came with no warning and no shape, only sensation. Hands at her neck, silver thread biting skin, laughter from a doorway, the sound of her crest striking stone and spinning away. She woke with a torn cry lodged in her throat, and both hands clawed over the old collar wound as if she could dig out the memory by force. Her breath refused rhythm. The room blurred. She fought air, blankets tangling around her legs, panic narrowing the world to touch and pressure, and the certainty that someone would drag her back through the gate if she stopped fighting even for a heartbeat. The door opened. She did not process who had entered, only that a larger shape moved toward her and she struck out on instinct. Her palm hit a hard chest. The figure did not retaliate. Isolde. Xavier's voice was low and rough, carrying through panic like a line thrown into floodwater. Look at me. She could not. Her fingers were still hooked at her own throat, nails biting skin. May I take your wrist so you stop hurting yourself? He asked, holding where she could see him. A broken sound caught in her chest. She gave a sharp, jerking nod. Warm hands closed around her wrists, not forceful, not trapping, steady as iron posts in river current. He knelt beside the bed on cold stone, placing himself below her eye line rather than above it. Breathe with me, he said. In. Hold. Out. She shook her head violently. I cannot. You can. He waited one beat. In. She caught half a breath. Lost it. Tried again. Xavier did not pry her hands away all at once. He untangled her fingers one by one from her throat, thumb pressing each knuckle gently until the locked tendons released. By the time he reached her smallest finger, her breathing had started to slow from ragged gasps into painful, manageable pulls. The mate bond hummed between them like drawn wire, urging proximity, urging trust, urging surrender. He kept his distance measured even now, knees on stone, one forearm resting on the edge of the mattress, gaze fixed on her face, and nowhere else. I am shaking in front of the most feared wolf in the north, and he is counting my breaths instead of my weakness. I am waiting for the price. There is always a price. A touch becomes a claim. A kindness becomes leverage. A rescue becomes a debt they collect in private. If I close my eyes, I am back at the gate. If I open them, he is here, and he is not taking anything. I do not know what to do with a man who holds power like this and still chooses restraint. I do not know where to put gratitude when fear has occupied every room inside me for so long. When her pulse finally eased, Xavier reached for the clay cup on the bedside table and tested the heat against his wrist before offering it. Moonroot, he said. Small sips. Her hands trembled too hard to hold it steady. He did not lift the cup to her mouth. He simply braced the base with 2 fingers while she gripped it and drank under her own control. One swallow, then another, until warmth settled in her stomach instead of panic. A smear of blood had darkened the blanket near her collarbone where her nails had reopened the skin. Isolde saw it and shame hit fast, automatic. I am sorry, she whispered. I stained your blanket. The corner of Xavier's mouth moved, not quite a smile, something older and sadder softening for an instant. Stone can crack and still carry kingdoms. The words landed in her like heat. He rose then, slow enough not to startle her, and crossed to the chair near the hearth where a heavy black cloak had been folded. Royal stitchwork flashed once at the hem in silver thread, frostborn wolves woven around a mountain crown. He returned and draped it over her shoulders, layering its weight over the blankets until she sat wrapped in cedar, wool, and unmistakable rank. You do not need to prove worth here by enduring pain silently, he said. A humorless breath escaped her before she could stop it. That might take practice. His gaze steadied on her, and for a flicker of a moment she saw the male beneath the crown with startling clarity. A man who had once trusted the wrong table and buried his brother because of it, who had turned his own voice into a locked gate, who now stood in an infirmary at night relearning speech in fragments because one exiled woman had asked not to be sent back. Practice is permitted, he said. He moved to the door and paused with his hand on the latch. I left 2 sentries outside. They answer to you in this room. If you tell them to fetch me, they fetch me. She did not know what expression crossed her face, only that his eyes sharpened as if receiving an answer she had not spoken aloud. Then he nodded once and left. By dawn, snow had gathered in a pale line along the window ledge, and Isolde woke with Xavier's cloak still around her, and no memory of when sleep had finally taken her. By the time the braziers were restoked for evening rounds, the tribunal summons arrived, stamped with frostborn black wax and the king's personal seal, cut through by a fresh thumbprint of blood. Lawful notice that the hearing would be witnessed, recorded, and binding. They held tribunal in the lower assembly chamber, a circular hall built around an old fighting pit sunk into the center floor. Frostborn council benches rose in tiers of dark wood. Torchlight trembled against carved pillars. Pack sentries lined the walls at equal intervals, spears grounded, faces expressionless. Isolde entered with Lawkeeper Sen on her left and Captain Torin on her right. Conversations thinned, then stopped. The room smelled of wool, steel oil, and restrained hostility. Elder Varric opened proceedings in a formal voice that carried to every corner. Matter before council, petition from Darkwater demanding return of Isolde Stoneheart as rejected Covenant property and alleging espionage under forged correspondence. He looked toward Isolde without warmth. Counterclaim. Sanctuary under Frostborn law pending verification. A messenger from a border pack stepped forward and unrolled a packet of letters. The wax seals were convincing at a glance, Darkwater blue pressed with Stoneheart crest. Isolde recognized the handwriting as an imitation of hers so close it made nausea climb her throat. She admits crossing under concealment, the messenger said. She reached your war hall on the same night these route diagrams vanished from Ironhowl stores. The timing is not a coincidence. A warrior on the second tier spat near the rail, contempt plain. Cast-off females learn fast when survival is on the line. Another voice joined from the back. Spoiled once, sold twice. Why should Frostborn bleed for her? Torin moved before Isolde understood he had shifted, shoulders squaring as if to step down into the pit himself. Sen caught his forearm, shaking her head toward the king's dais. Xavier had not spoken yet. He sat at the high seat above the pit, elbows on the carved arms, face unreadable. When the second insult landed, he stood. The chamber tightened. He descended the dais stairs with predatory calm and stopped at the pit's edge directly in front of Isolde. Amber kindled in his eyes. Bone shifted under skin with a hard, audible crack. Claws slid from his fingertips. His canines lengthened as the wolf surfaced just enough to remind every witness what sat beneath Frostborn discipline. By name, he said, voice like drawn metal. Isolde Stoneheart is under my sanctuary. No one interrupted. He turned slowly, making deliberate eye contact with each tier as he continued. Ancient law does not recognize persons as property. Any wolf using that language in my hall insults this crown and the moon codes that predate it. His gaze fixed on the warrior who had spat. You will apologize now, or you will answer in the pit. The warrior swallowed, color draining from his face. I spoke out of turn. Not apology. Xavier's lip curled slightly over one elongated canine. Try again. The warrior bowed his head to Isolde. I withdraw the insult. Silence followed, thick and absolute. Xavier addressed the full chamber. If any wolf questions her honor, step down and challenge me under witness. No one moved. Spears remained grounded. Even Elder Varric looked at the floor. The power in the room changed shape in that stillness. This was not private comfort in an infirmary where no one had to see him be gentle. This was public risk, political and immediate, taken without hesitation on her behalf. Xavier nodded once to Sen. Proceed with evidence. Sen called for ink comparison, sent verification on the letters, and testimony from the courier route masters. One by one, the pieces unraveled. The wax had Darkwater pigment but Ironhowl resin in the binder. 2 signatures were traced from old trade records. A route mark used in one letter had been retired a year earlier and replaced after flood damage, a detail no current scout would miss. By the end of the second hour, the prevailing conclusion was no longer ambiguous. The letters were crafted to look plausible to outsiders while seeding distrust on purpose. When Varick announced that the espionage claim was unproven and likely fabricated by a third party, a low current of unease moved through the benches. Isolde felt it too. Someone had built this net carefully. Someone expected her to be disposable enough that no one checked the knots. As counselors rose to recess, one elder leaned toward another and muttered, not quietly enough. He will regret chaining his throne to her scandal. Xavier heard. He did not snarl. He did not threaten. He only answered with cold precision. My throne is not chained. It is choosing. Then he stepped beside Isolde and paused, waiting until she met his eyes, and gave the smallest nod before placing his hand, warm and steady, at the small of her back. The touch was unmistakably protective and unmistakably public. He guided her toward the exit through a corridor of wolves who parted without being told. She felt every stare, every recalculation, every old reflex urging her to make herself smaller, quieter, less costly to defend. Instead, she matched Xavier's pace, shoulders straight under his cloak, breath evening with each step. At the door, he bent just enough that only she could hear. You did not lower your eyes once. Isolde looked up at him, surprised to find the compliment mattered. I nearly did. Nearly is not the same. Outside, cold air hit her face, clean and sharp. For the first time since the gate slammed behind her in Darkwater, the knot behind her ribs loosened by a fraction. Guard was not gone. Fear was not gone. But as Xavier kept his hand at her back and walked her into the winter light, she let herself believe that under this crown, protection might mean what it said. The belief lasted until Captain Torrin intercepted them at the lower stair with a rider behind him. Both men rhymed in roadfrost and urgency. Majesty, Torrin said, fist to chest, then to Isolde in formal acknowledgement. Lawkeeper Sen requests immediate counsel in the map chamber. Border dispatch from Grey Hollow and a captured courier from Iron Howl. Xavier's posture shifted in a way Isolde was learning to read. Not surprise, not hesitation, but a sharpening of intent that made nearby guards step wider without being told. Alive? The courier, Torrin answered. Barely cooperative, he carried 6 sealed copies of the forged accusations and 1 private directive addressed to Raven Stormborn's quartermaster. At the name, Sen appeared from the colonnade with rolled hides tucked under her arm and a narrow iron box clamped shut by chain. We cracked the cipher stamp. It is his. Her gaze cut to Isolde, keen and unsparing. The letters were never about proving you guilty. They were about making everyone else comfortable treating you as expendable. They moved at once, boots striking stone in tight rhythm through halls lit by noon-pale windows, and braziers burned low for day watch. The map chamber sat beneath the western tower, built for siege planning rather than diplomacy, circular walls covered in layered vellum maps pinned with obsidian markers. Isolde stopped at the threshold when she saw the center table. 3 letters lay open beside a carved token shaped like a raven's wing, black bone polished to a mirror sheen. Sen unchained the iron box and removed the final page with gloved fingers. Read, she said to the scribe. He swallowed and obeyed. Phase 1 continues. Feed Stoneheart papers to border packs through neutral traders. Force Frostborn to defend Scandal. Phase 2 at Moon Market Procession. Breach under South Bridge. Seize female alive. Draw king across truce line in pursuit. If he crosses, coalition claim activates. Crown falls by his own hand. Silence gathered, dense and hostile. Isolde felt the room tilt by a degree, not from injury this time, but from the cold precision of the plan. Her disgrace had been weaponized into logistics, her face on paper, her body as bait, her survival as trigger. Torin pointed to the map where red pins marked Iron Howl territory and amber pins marked Frostborn patrol routes. Raven has been moving mercenaries through grain caravans for 2 weeks. He rotated command signs every third night, so scouts reported normal traffic. Grey Hollow confirmed 2 of their elders received your forged confession and a second note warning Xavier intends annexation. Sen added, "He is courting fear, not loyalty. Pax uncertain of Frostborn authority will join any coalition that promises stability, even if built on lies." Xavier studied the page, expression carved from stone. What does he want beyond territory? Sen did not soften it. To break your legitimacy. You ruled a year in silence and held the borders through discipline. He cannot defeat that in open challenge, so he will make your restraint look like weakness and your attachment look like a flaw. Attachment. The word hovered between the 4 of them like a blade set flat on a table, visible, unavoidable, dangerous if touched carelessly. Isolde stepped closer to the letters. Her pulse stayed steady only because she forced it to. He wrote this before tribunal. Likely before you cross the border, Sen said. Your rejection gave him the perfect story and a plausible path inside our legal process. Xavier's gaze moved to her, and for one stark breath, the king disappeared behind the man, the male who had knelt on cold stone and counted her breaths in the dark. You are not his leverage, he said. Evidence suggested he meant it as command, promise, and plea at once. Torin cleared his throat. Majesty, there is more. 2 allied pack leaders responded to our request for verification. Pine Reach rejected the letters as fabrication and offers riders. Ashven declined commitment and asked whether Frostborn intends to elevate a disputed female over treaty custom. The room went still again. External doubt, now formal. Xavier took the written replies, scanned them, and handed one to Isolde without theatrics. Read. She did. Ashvin's script was elegant, measured, and vicious in its caution. No insults, only distance. No accusation, only the suggestion that her presence had destabilized regional order. The kind of wording councils preferred because it left no stain while it did damage. Sen watched her face. Raven knows exactly where institutions fracture. Isolde set the letter down with deliberate care. Then we stop treating this as rumor control and start treating it as war preparation. Xavier's mouth tightened, almost approval. Agreed. The tribunal had ended, but the pressure did not lift. It simply changed shape and followed them deeper into the keep. Orders moved out from the map chamber in tight, disciplined waves, and the gate watches were shifted to half-bell rotations before the afternoon light had fully faded from the high windows. Isolde spent the remaining daylight in the archive vault with Sen and 2 ward scribes, reviewing old sanctuary clauses and territorial lattice diagrams because Raven's directive had lodged in her mind, like splintered glass. Breach under South Bridge. Frostborn's wards were not a single wall of power, but a network of rune pylons keyed to moon cycles. Bloodline permissions and spoken passphrases changed every quarter. Stoneheart training had once required her to memorize allied ward structures for treaty season. Tedious work she had resented as a girl and now clung to as one of the few tools no one could strip from her. Near full dark, Xavier found her standing over a spread of diagrams in the Western War Room, shoulders tight beneath plain wool, hair braided back to keep ink from her face. Snow hissed against the shutters. A single lamp burned between them, throwing gold over his knuckles and the sharp bridge of his nose. You should be resting, he said. You should be sleeping, she replied, then winced at her own tone. A faint, fleeting curve touched his mouth. Practice is permitted, remember? She exhaled and tapped the map. South Bridge sits above a maintenance culvert linked to 2 old pylons. If someone had retired passphrases and access routes from before the flood repairs, they could force a temporary desync. Not enough to collapse the whole perimeter, enough to open a gap for a strike team. He moved beside her, close enough that the cedar storm scent of him threaded through lamp smoke. Can you rekey it? Not from this table. At the pylon itself, yes. If the Moonstone accepts Stoneheart bloodline authentication. She kept her eyes on the map because looking at him for too long made concentration slippery. There is no guarantee. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried awareness, memory, and the relentless pull that still tightened whenever they stood within arm's reach. Standing beside him, her body knew before thought could catch up. The bond caught fire under her skin each time he turned toward her, and fear answered it because wanting had always been the doorway harm walked through. She wanted to lean into the steadiness he offered. She wanted to trust that his protection was not a temporary political weather pattern. She wanted to stop measuring each kindness for hidden cost. She was still learning the shape of safety, and safety with desire braided through it felt almost more frightening than danger alone. If she stepped forward, she could lose herself. If she stepped back, she could lose the first true thing she had been given in years. Xavier spoke softly, as if he had heard the tremor beneath her stillness even without words. If Raven strikes at Market, you go to Inner Keep. She met his gaze then. Amber had darkened in his eyes, the predator alert and leashed. If he strikes at the bridge and touches the pylons, Inner Keep becomes a tomb. I will not use you as countermeasure. I am not asking to be used. Her voice held. I am asking to be allowed to choose. The tension between command and respect stretched to its limit. Finally, he nodded once, stiffly, as though conceding a point that hurt. If the ward line falters, you move with guard detail to the pylons, not alone. Agreed. A knock cut through the moment. Torin entered with a grim set to his jaw. Scouts confirmed Raven's personal war banner sighted near Hollow Pass at dusk. He is within 1 day ride. Pressure settled over the room like fresh snow over thin ice. Xavier issued orders without raising his voice. Double plainclothes watch at Market, seal culvert grates, rotate archers above South Bridge, and quietly pull non-combatants from Riverside stalls before moonrise. Sen added legal directives for witness recorders at all key points. If Raven wanted optics, Frostborn would answer with documented truth. By moonrise, lanterns hung in long chains from carved beams, turning the lower terraces into rivers of amber light and moving shadows. Traders from 6 territories filled the square with spice smoke, wool bundles, forged trinkets, and careful smiles that concealed allegiance. Music from a reed flute drifted over the crowd in uneven notes. On the surface, it looked like commerce preserved in spite of winter and politics. Underneath, it was a battlefield waiting for first blood. Isolde walked the inner ring with 2 guards and Mara at her shoulder under the pretense of checking healer tents. Xavier moved a level above through the command path, visible by design. Black cloak marked with silver crown runes that made space open ahead of him as he passed. Their eyes met across the moving crowd at every turn, a silent count. Here, here, still here. Then a spice cart overturned near the South Bridge. Not an accident. The driver abandoned the reins too quickly, and the sacks that split on stone spilled not cumin or pepper, but powdered chalk used to blind scent tracking. Wind carried it low in a pale cloud. One guard cursed and grabbed a scarf over his mouth. Another reached for Isolde's arm. The bridge shuddered. A crack tore across the paving stones, thin at first, then widening with a roar as the maintenance culvert beneath gave way. Lantern chains snapped and dropped sparks. People screamed and surged backward. 3 masked men came up through the breach on grapples, moving with military precision. A 4th loosed a bolt that shattered the nearest ward marker and sent silver light stuttering along the terrace edge. "Take Stoneheart alive," one of them shouted. Everything accelerated. Guards collided with attackers in tight, brutal bursts of motion. Market stalls toppled. Horses screamed from the lower ramp. From above, Xavier vaulted the rail and landed hard beside the breach, blade already drawn, voice cutting through panic like a command bell. Shield the civilians. Collapse the inner lane. Isolde, inner keep now. She turned to run, then stopped dead as a sound rolled under the chaos, deep and wrong, the pylon's harmonic hum dropping out of sequence, one note missing, then two. Raven's passphrases were working. Across the square, beyond smoke and splintered timber, the central moonstone at the south pylon flickered from silver to dim gray. If it went dark, the ward lattice would open wide enough for every hidden unit outside the walls. Mara gripped her sleeve. Do not. Isolde pulled free, heart pounding against her ribs in hard, measured strikes. If I go to Inner Keep, he gets what he came for. She looked up once. Xavier had seen the same flicker. She read it in the sharp turn of his head, the raw fury in his stance as he cut through a masked fighter and shouted her name. The bond between them flared with his fear and her resolve, bright as wire under strain. She ran toward the failing pylon as the first ward line went dark. She hit the lower terrace at a sprint, boots sliding on shattered spice and wet stone, and the south square opened in front of her like a torn map. Half the bridge had dropped into the culvert, leaving a jagged mouth in the pavement where masked fighters kept climbing up in twos. Lantern fire swung wildly from broken chains. A mule cart overturned and blocked the eastern lane. Wolves in market leathers were shoving civilians toward the monastery arch, while frostborn guards formed a defensive crescent and took bolts on raised shields. Above the noise, a horn gave 3 short notes from beyond the outer wall. Not market panic. Signal. Raven had timed his strike force with units outside the ward line. Isolde, fall back. Xavier's voice carried from the breach, edged with command and fear. He was already fighting at the choke point, black cloak gone, blade bright with wardlight as he drove one attacker off the stone lip and kicked another back into the collapse. Inner keep, now! She kept running toward the pylon. A masked mercenary intercepted her from the right, curved knife low and fast. Her guard caught the first slash, stumbled on broken timber, and went down hard. Isolde ducked the second cut by instinct, grabbed a fallen lantern pole with both hands, and shoved it into the attacker's knees. He pitched sideways. She did not wait to see him rise. The pylon stood 20 paces ahead, waist-high moonstone set in a ring of carved granite, every rune along its base stuttering between silver and ash gray. A second ward marker near the stair went fully dark, and the air pressure changed at once, that subtle defensive hum collapsing into a hollow ache that made her teeth hurt. Someone laughed from the far side of the square. Raven Stormborn stepped onto a slab of broken bridge as if mounting a dais built for him. Long coat thrown back, scar crossing one cheek, eyes bright with triumph and old malice. He did not rush. He wanted to be seen. Careful, he called to his fighters. Do not damage her hands. We still need her alive. His gaze found Isolde and held, measuring, amused. There you are, the disputed female who rewrote border law by bleeding attractively in the right hall. Fury went cold in her chest. Torin reached her then with 4 wolves at his back. We can still pull you out through west stairs. Isolde pointed at the moonstone. If that goes dark, west stairs become an open gate. Another horn answered from outside, closer this time. Then arrows arced in from the river approach, not enough to kill at range, enough to force Frostborn shields downward while 2 more saboteurs slammed iron wedges into the cracked pylon base. Stone split with a sound like ice breaking on a lake. Raven spread his hands toward Xavier as if presenting proof. You see? Not strength. Predictability. All I needed was one woman you would not sacrifice. Xavier's snarl carried even across steel and shouting. He cut down the nearest saboteur and advanced 2 strides, but 3 mercenaries hit him together from the flank, buying Raven one more breath of theater. Isolde reached the moonstone and dropped to her knees beside it. The surface was cold enough to burn. Every lesson she had half-hated in Stoneheart archives rose with punishing clarity. Lineage keys, blood gates, harmonic resets, final phrases never written in public records. Her right hand shook once. She steadied it by pressing her wrist to the carved rim. I can still run. I can choose safety and call it obedience. I can let stronger wolves decide whether this kingdom survives tonight. If I do that, Raven writes the ending and everyone will name it strategy. But I know this lattice. I know what he stole. And I know exactly what happens when women like me agree to be moved as pieces while men debate honor over our heads. I am done being useful to other people's fear. I am done waiting for permission to exist in my own life. If this burns me out, it burns me standing where I chose to stand. She tore a splinter of iron from a broken ceremonial banner stake, drew it hard across her palm, and pressed blood to the moonstone's center. The stone answered. Silver flared up her arm in a violent surge, not heat, but pressure, as if mountain weight had been poured through human bone. Runes around the base snapped from gray to white. The ground beneath the terrace trembled. Wolves shouted and reeled as a ring of light shot outward from the pylon, climbed the nearest markers, and slammed into the breached culvert mouth like a closing jaw. Raven's smile vanished. "Stop her!" he barked. 2 fighters broke for Isolde. She kept one hand welded to the moonstone and threw her left toward the carved notch at the base, blood smearing into old script as she shouted the first Stoneheart reset phrase. The paving stones around the breach heaved upward in a rough circle, not high enough to crush, high enough to pen. Mercenaries inside the ring hit an invisible boundary and were thrown back in sparks. Xavier drove free of his flank attackers and moved toward her, panic riding the bond in a raw, relentless pulse. "Isolde, release it. Release. You are overloading." 30 heartbeats, she shouted back through clenched teeth. "Hold him for 30. By the time the church bell in the north quarter rang once through the chaos, the ward line had relit along the south wall in staggered waves. Archers on Frostborn towers took their lanes again. Outside units lost their entry corridor and scattered under counterfire from the battlements. Inside the circle, Raven's strike team was trapped in a shrinking arena of silver-lit stone and collapsing exits. Raven shifted. The change hit fast and brutal, bones lengthening, shoulders blowing wide, fur ripping through cloth until a massive scar-scored wolf stood where the man had been, black coat striped with old healed marks, jaws wide in a roar that shook dust from the bridge ruins. He launched straight at the barrier, hit, rebounded, and then found the weak seam where Isolde's control wavered under the mounting strain. He tore through. Xavier met him mid-lunge. Wolf and man crashed through fractured granite, rolled, and came up striking in a blur of claws, blade, and snapping jaws. Xavier half-shifted as he fought, fangs bared, amber blazing, one hand on his sword hilt, and the other catching Raven's throat long enough to drive him into a toppled stall frame. Wood exploded. Raven twisted free and raked across Xavier's shoulder guard, forcing him back 2 steps. Isolde felt every hit through the bond as a distant thunder in her ribs, while she held the moonstone and the failing ring together by force. Her vision narrowed. Blood from her palm ran down the carved channels and steamed silver where it touched activated runes. If she lost the phrase sequence now, the pen collapsed, and Raven would have open lanes again. She forced breath, spoke the second line, then the third. Raven feinted left, took Xavier's blade on his foreleg, and used the opening to spring past him toward her. Too fast for a guard intercept, too close for an archer shot. He came in low for her throat. Isolde let go of the moonstone with her left hand, grabbed the broken ceremonial stake she had dropped beside her knee, pivoted on the stone rim, and drove the iron point upward into the joint behind Raven's right shoulder as he hit her. Momentum carried both of them a half turn before the stake punched into fractured paving and locked. Raven slammed sideways, pinned to the ground with a howl that rattled the pylon. She held the shaft with both hands, breath shaking, and shouted the final binding phrase in the old Stoneheart tongue. By root and ridge, by oath and witness, be named and kneel. The ward ring answered like a struck bell. Silver bands snapped over Raven's body. Fur receded in violent ripples. Limbs shortened. The wolf collapsed into a human frame bound in light, one knee forced to stone, one arm trapped by the iron stake through his shoulder joint. He spat blood-flecked breath and tried to rise. The bands tightened. He stayed kneeling. The square went silent in widening circles as fighters on both sides saw him bound. Xavier crossed the distance in 6 hard strides and set his blade at Raven's neck, chest heaving, eyes feral and focused. He did not strike. He looked at Isolde. Challenge law. Witness decision. Raven lifted his head just enough to sneer at her through pain. He will discard you when your use is done. Isolde stepped closer, hand still bleeding, voice steady enough to carry to the outer steps. You mistook mercy for weakness. Raven laughed once, broken and bitter. Then prove you are not weak. Tell him to end it. Xavier did not move the blade. Your word, High Sanctuary Claimant, he said, formal in a way that made the moment irreversible. Life sentence in moon cells or execution under war challenge. She looked at Raven and saw the ledger of what he had chosen. Forged law, staged abduction, civilians used as cover, packs pushed toward war so he could wear legitimacy stolen from ruins. Mercy would not reform him. Mercy would fund his next attempt. Execution, she said. Xavier nodded once. The strike was swift, clean and final, delivered under full witness with no flourish and no second blow. Raven's body went still against the stone while the silver bands dissolved into drifting sparks. Around them, Frostborn guards secured surviving mercenaries, disarmed the wounded, and began calling names for healer triage with battle-trained precision. Isolde's knees threatened to fold as the pylon's light steadied, and the last unstable rune clicked back into sequence. Xavier turned from Raven and reached her in 2 steps, stopping close enough to catch her if she fell, but waiting for the smallest sign before touching. She gave it. His hands closed around her forearms, grounding, careful despite blood and tremor. Their foreheads nearly touched as the bond settled from battle fire into a deep, shaking current of relief and shock. Torin's voice cut in from behind them, hoarse with disbelief and triumph. South line restored. Outer units are retreating. Pine Reach riders just signaled support at the East Road. Sen appeared at the edge of the broken ring with 2 recorders and a slate already inked. Witness log complete, she said, gaze fixed on Raven's body, then on Isolde. Attempted abduction, unlawful breach, challenge execution. No council can rewrite this by morning. Above the square, the Frostborn war banner snapped once in the winter wind as if the fortress itself had exhaled. Isolde did not realize she was swaying until a Frostborn healer's hands were on her elbows and Torin was calling for space around the pylon. The courtyard moved in layered motion, guards binding survivors, healers kneeling by the fallen, Sen directing recorders to tag every body, every weapon, every seal ring. Raven's dead lay under a wool shroud near the shattered bridge, the iron stake still pinning his shoulder where challenge witnesses could see it had been lawful. Xavier stood with Isolde at the center of the ruined ward circle, one hand braced at her back, blood drying on his knuckles and jaw set against whatever he was holding in. Majesty, Sen said, approaching with her slate and the chained iron box. Before the moon dips, the council requests formal disposition of evidence and status. Her gaze shifted to Isolde, softer by a degree. And there is one more matter that cannot be delayed without inviting dispute. Torin lifted the black bone raven token in a gloved hand. Recovered from Raven's coat, matches the one found in the map chamber. A recorder knelt by a fallen mercenary and held up a leather satchel. War ledgers, coded columns, route payments. Sen took the satchel, opened it, and flipped pages by brazier light. Names, dates, pay lines to neutral traders, and resin purchases used in the forged seals. This is enough to break the coalition claim before it forms. Xavier nodded once. Secure chain of custody. Every page copied by Dawn. Sen hesitated, then looked between them. If you intend a claim, do it now. You both know what this battlefield has already declared. Delay gives cowards room to reinterpret. Silence fell in a widening ring. Frostborn counselors gathered on the upper steps, ash and snow on their cloaks, while the same warrior who had insulted Isolde at tribunal kept his head bowed. No one spoke. Xavier turned fully toward her. The feral edge in his eyes had receded, but the force of him remained, controlled and absolute. He did not touch her throat, did not assume, did not command. He dropped to one knee on broken stone in front of her, in full view of council, guards, healers, witnesses from two allied packs, and said in a voice still rough from disuse yet carrying to the far stair, Isolde Stoneheart, I ask to mark you as my mate before witness and moon. If your answer is no, I stand down and your sanctuary remains untouched. The world narrowed to that question. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. The old reflex rose first, the one trained by years of public expectation and private dismissal. Brace, endure, give the answer that preserves order. Then another truth rose beneath it, steadier. He had given her law when she had none, choice when she had none, and now, at the most binding threshold, he gave her choice again. I am not being exchanged. I am not being assigned. I am being asked. She stepped forward. Slowly, because her legs still shook. Deliberately, because she wanted every witness to understand what consent looked like. She lifted her hair from her neck with both hands and bared the junction of throat and shoulder. Yes, she said, mark me. A sound moved through the watching wolves, not cheering, something older and reverent. Xavier rose, close now, and his fingers framed her jaw with a care that made her eyes burn. Tell me if I hurt you past what you accept. He murmured for her alone. I will. He breathed once against her skin, cedar and storm and winter, then his mouth found her neck. Fangs pierced in one clean, deep bite. Pain flashed white and sharp, enough to steal air from her lungs, enough to make her hands clutch his forearms. The pain did not stay pain. It unfurled, molten and bright, pouring through her bloodstream in waves that felt like frozen ground thawing under spring flood. Heat raced down her spine, up her throat, through the hand that had bled on Moonstone. The bond between them, raw and storm-loud since the war hall, locked into place with a resonant pull that shook her to the marrow. Xavier held her through it, one arm hard around her waist, the other bracing her shoulders while he sealed the mark with his tongue. His breath shuddered as if he were the one breaking open. Mine, he whispered against her skin, not as possession, but as vow. She drew back just enough to meet his eyes. Amber burned there, and no part of him looked away. She took his left wrist, turned it, bared her own fangs, and bit him in return. The taste of salt and iron hit first, then the same blazing current surged through them both, doubled now, reciprocal, and fierce. His head tipped back on a rough exhale as her mark took. Gold-white light arced between their chests, visible and undeniable, a taut thread brightening into a woven strand that pulsed with each synchronized heartbeat. Yours, she said, voice shaking. Mate, he answered. Around them, The council dropped to one knee in a rustle of wool and steel. Torin's fist struck his chest. The healers at the perimeter bowed their heads, some openly weeping. A council herald knelt and called out, "By witness, by law, by moon, recognized." The warrior who had mocked her stepped forward, eyes on the stone. "High apology," he said. "I spoke dishonor. I was wrong." Isolde inclined her head, not magnanimous, simply done carrying his contempt. "Record it," she told Senator Sendid, then passed the slate to the nearest recorder. Recorded and sealed. Xavier rested his forehead to Isolde's, both of them breathing hard as the bond settled from wildfire into a deep, steady hum. He spoke so only she heard. "I answer you." She closed her eyes, hands still gripping him as if the earth might shift again. "Then hear me for the rest of our lives." 3 days later, under a cold noon sky in Frostborn's Great Hall, the treaty summit opened with every contested item laid on a single ironwood table, the forged letters with iron howl resin identified, Raven's directive from the chained box, the black bone token, the recovered war ledgers, courier testimony, and Sen's witness logs from the bridge. Representatives from Pine Reach, Grey Hollow, and Ashfen stood in a half circle while Frostborn recorders copied every page in duplicate. No rumor survived that table. The Grey Hollow elder confirmed the hunting call reports and Raven's bribed traders. Pine Reach's leader, scarred and blunt, pledged riders to enforce the new arbitration routes. Ashfen's emissary read their prior letter aloud, then burned it in the brazier and replaced it with a signed accord, recognizing Isolde as High Luna of Frostborn and Keeper of Wards under Allied law. When Darkwater's delegation entered, it was led by an unnamed legal delegate bearing sealed packets and 2 neutral witnesses. Sen opened the packets at the table and read the first affidavit into record. Sworn testimony from Elder Brenna that at Isolde's rejection right, Darkwater's Beta had threatened sanctions if Isolde objected. The emergency petition had been coerced, and the culling language had violated Moon Code. The second filing was a certified non-contestation notice entered under Alaric Darkwater's seal and countersigned by Darkwater's law office, conceding no challenge to Frostborn's witnessed sanctuary or mate recognition. Neither filing survived cross-check against the evidence chain. Both were absorbed into it. No statement from the Stoneheart Patriarch arrived before adjournment. Isolde read the empty line in the record and understood at last that his silence would never turn into courage. She let that truth pass through her without letting it root. At dusk, the final clauses were read aloud in the courtyard where the wardstone had been reset. Rejected mates could no longer be treated as transferable property in any Allied territory. Sanctuary pleas required immediate neutral review. Forged covenant evidence carried war crime penalties. Sen sealed the charter with black wax. The Frostborn Council proclamation then announced Isolde's elevation by unanimous vote. Torin fastened a new crest cloak over her shoulders, Stoneheart obsidian set beside Frostborn silver to mark joined authority rather than erased origin. The next Dawn Council began before sunrise. Frost glazed the windows. A junior healer handed Isolde hot moonroot broth as scribes took their places and captains filed border reports now absent of emergency horns. Xavier entered last, crossed directly to her side, and spoke first without prompting, his hand briefly finding hers beneath the table where only she could feel it. "Good morning, my queen." Warmth spread through her, quiet and profound. "Good morning, my king." Outside, ward pylons hummed in perfect sequence, and inside, when policy disputes sharpened and old habits tried to return, the Alpha King who had once gone wordless answered in his own voice, while his mate beside him answered back.